Hello, hello, fifth graders. Welcome. I can see there are a few of us already here who have written in the chat. We are going to not waste another second and get started since y'all have makerspace in 15 minutes, 14 minutes. So what you are going to need is that note taker that we had to start with on Tuesday. So we are getting ready to dive right back into where we left off in our core lesson. Today we are continuing off in that kind of zoom out view of looking at voting rights history throughout our history. And we are going to start with the 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was written. And this is before the US Constitution was adopted. So we are going to talk about what all of that means as far as who gets to vote, what laws are passed that allow people to vote, and then knowing that we have laws that are passed, why are there still issues with certain groups of people being able to vote? So, excellent. Thank you so much. I see Ava has her note taker up, and so does a few other people. I'm glad that you are following along and ready. To be sure, we are, if following along and watching this video for the first time without taking notes is more helpful, and then coming back and watching it again to take notes, I highly recommend that. We are going to be moving a bit quick, so if I am moving too fast for you, you can either write in the chat and say please slow down, or know that you can always pause the video, which can't really happen in real life. So this is one of those special things. Okay, let's get started. So I want us to get ready. We are about to embark on our civics lesson. I want to go just to remind us of our teaching point. Okay, so our teaching point is, say it with me, I can identify how voting rights have changed over history. The other piece of this that I want to put out there is maybe a focus question is, how has voting rights limited certain people from voting? So rather looking at it as voting, for who can vote, who does voting exclude? And why throughout history do we have moments of exclusion, of not allowing certain people to vote? So the expectations for this is that you are following along with me, that you're taking notes, and you are asking questions. These are all really important pieces and things when we are learning about history. Okay, absolutely. If you already filled something out, excellent. If you see that there are new things up here that you didn't see before, please add to it. I'm going to be partially reading off things, but also we're going to be doing a few new things as well. Before we start, I want to remind us of a few definitions. We have two definitions up here: citizenship and democracy. Now, we've talked about this idea of citizenship in fourth grade and even in fifth grade. Consider when I use the word citizenship. We've talked a lot about what it means to be a digital citizenship, to be a digital citizen, where you have responsibilities and rights on this online community, this digital platform. So, take a minute to look at this. You don't need to write down these definitions at this time. However, if it is helpful to you, go for it. We define a citizen as someone who is participating within a political community. I find it funny, there are a lot of people who often say, I'm not a political person, yet they are a citizen of the United States. And to be a citizen is to be a participatory member of a political community. Everybody is political, whether they realize it or not. And we do this because, there are people who live in a country and are also not necessarily citizens. We know people who have immigrated from different countries here. There are some people who are refugees who are coming and leaving their country to come and stay here. And knowing that not everybody who lives in the United States are citizens, how does that affect our voting? And especially when voting is supposed to represent its people. And so those are larger questions. If you have more questions about citizenship, go ahead and write them down, okay? But to know that being a citizen doesn't necessarily throughout history mean that you get to vote. It just means that you are, you have been given a certain right and privilege because of how the state or the nation or the local government sees fit. And then to know and reframe that we are a democracy. Throughout history, we hear this word, democracy, and, thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a part of a democracy? Well, in Greek, this word comes from a Greek word which means ruled by the people. And I love this. Absolutely. So a democracy is a type of government system. There are different other types of government systems that are different than democracy, such as socialism or communism or even like dictatorships. There are even, communities like or systems of government like in England, where it is passed down. There's king and queenships. So we are a democracy here in the United States. And so these are kind of important to frame. The other definition that I actually didn't include in here, but I want to bring up because we are going to be seeing this word often, is the word amendment. Say this word with me. Amendment. To amend something is to fix something. When we make something and put it out for the world, at least in our community, we know that we have the right to say, actually, I'm going to change my mind and I want to fix this and make this better, right? We never show up and say, all right, that's it, I'm done, we're good to go. Constitution is fine the way it is, and it's perfect, we don't need to do anything. Is that true? No, it is not true. Of course things need to be changed and revisited because, history, the study of change over time. Our laws need to reflect the change that's occurring in our lives. So amendments are made to our Constitution to add, to change, to make better, right? Kind of like that delta that we talk about. So we've gone through these three definitions: citizenship, democracy, and amendments, okay? And so I want us to kind of put that in the back of our head to consider while we're going through these different time periods, okay? So let's move on. 1776, you know this one. It's the Declaration of Independence was signed. Only people who own land, who are white, who are males, even in most cases, it was outlined that, to vote during colonial and revolutionary times, so this was like leading up to the American Revolution, most often it was even people who were a certain religion, as Protestants, were allowed to vote, okay? Now, this is where we have said, okay, we are no longer a part of Britain and, the English colonies. And it wasn't until nearly just over a decade later, in 1787, when the Constitution was adopted. Okay, so the Constitution says, like, these are what the rules are. Now, we are going to have moments where we are going to get to do some more deep learning of what the Constitution is, what is a part of it. But for now, I want us to understand that when we first said we are going to be independent colonies from the British, that only a certain group of people were allowed to vote. And really this is important because even when George Washington, our very first president, was elected in 1789, only 6% of the population was allowed to vote. Consider. It's very small group of people, okay? So the point that I'm trying to make is knowing who was allowed to vote, what was the law or the legal system in place that said that, right? This is the Declaration of Independence, said that only people who owned land, who were white, who were male, and who were over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. Let's move on to 1790. Well, this is when the naturalization law was passed. Okay, this law stated that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. So this means that if you were there and that you were a free white person, that you could become a citizen, all right? Now, just to be clear, just because this law guaranteed citizenship did not mean that all white people could vote. Going back to that very first piece of in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, only landowners and white older men could vote. So even though it was saying, oh, you're a citizen, you can be a citizen of the United States of America, but you as a citizen still do not have the right to vote. Okay. Let's move along. 1856 comes around. Ooh, that's a big jump. We went from 1790 to 1856. Now, don't get it twisted. There is a lot of very interesting and important events that happen in between here, okay? Especially as it relates to somebody called Frederick Douglass and other, who was an incredible politician and historical figure who worked with women for women's rights. But we are going to come back to that later. What I want us to know now is in 1856, because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, say that with me, Guadalupe Hidalgo, this ended a war that was going on called the Mexican-American War. Now, this is a bit contentious. This has a little bit of, some problems in here because this war happened, and most of what, even where we are living today, most of California was a part of Mexico, and so many other parts of the United States that we know today was a part of Mexico. Well, when this treaty was signed, it ended the war, and it said that anybody who was living on a conquered territory, right? So consider like the land that they were on didn't belong to them. It was home for Native Americans and so many other historical people. But they were said, well, you can keep this land if you were living there before, and you can vote. But there were some issues. Okay, there were still limits to who could vote there during this time, even if you were a Mexican-American male who was allowed to live on the territory that they were living in before. There were language requirements. So if all of a sudden you found out, oh, my house that I'm living on, that I've lived in forever, is now a part of America and I can have say to vote. Well, now I have to learn a whole new language. And so there were limits of who could vote based on the language that you spoke. And so this is another instance where there were a lot of English language requirements. But not just this, there was also voting and violent intimidation towards Mexican Americans when they did go to try to cast their vote. Another interesting thing that I didn't include in 1856 is that, you guys, I made a mistake. I did make a very big mistake. This treaty actually did not happen. I'm double checking my notes here. It did not happen in 1856. This treaty happened just a few years earlier, 1848. I am so sorry that I made that mistake. So thank you for being flexible with me. So in your notes, go ahead and change that. 1848. This is when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was agreed upon. The 1856 one that I meant to say is this is where the vote was expanded to all white men. Okay, so all white men were given the right to vote, and that they did not necessarily need to be property owners to vote. Okay, so it wasn't until nearly 100 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, so about 80 years afterwards, were all white men allowed to vote. So then they got rid of the requirement to be able to, that you had to have that you had to own property. Okay, I'm looking at the time, and I want to say I'm going to give one more of these. We're going to go through one more, and then everything else can be left blank because I want to make sure that you are able to make it for Makerspace relatively on time. Okay, so what I'm going to actually do is we're going to kind of come to a close, and I am going to share the rest of this PowerPoint with you so that when you are, oopsies, here we go, so that when you are, yeah, thank you so much. What about 1848? There is a box that I skipped about that. Yep, so 1848 is when citizenship was granted to Mexican Americans, and I totally skipped out on 1856. So shout out to those of you who caught that. And Quincy, I'm curious about what you meant when you said, what does free mean in that? Free, I think that you were possibly talking about free white immigrants, right? So there were people who were not free, right? The slavery was, you know, still a thing that mostly affected African Americans, enslaved Black people, but you know, African Americans and enslaved Black people were not the only ones who were slaves. That being said, consider throughout our history who had been oppressed the most. Okay, thank you, Quincy, for confirming that. So we're going to wrap up for today in, you know, just coming back to that teaching point of how has voting rights history changed throughout time. Okay, and already we're starting to see a pattern that it took some time for people throughout history to get voting rights. And the other thing that I'm even thinking about is who were the activists that were doing all of this work behind the scenes to ensure that people had the right to vote. Because this did not just happen overnight for no reason. There were people who were making noise, disrupting the regular, you know, system that was at play, okay? And so this is where starting to learn this larger sense, we're going to start to zoom into certain areas and unpack all of the people that were involved, all of the other voting legislation that had to occur, and you know, even going into the courts and how things came about for change. So with that, I'm going to send you off on your way so that you are no longer 5 more minutes late, no more than 5 minutes late to Makerspace, and I will see the rest of you, some of you for writing today for a writing small group at 2 o'clock, and then the rest I'll see you at 2:30 for closing.